morning, everyone. Morning to Sue. I just saw her smiling face there. Okay.
You could end 3 minutes early.
Okay.
So that I have a few more minutes for announcements later. The bell won't ring though.
Oh, okay.
So
So just
like
not
at 10:40.
40?
Yeah.
Okay. Just not to catch my attention. Okay, we're picking up again where we left off last week. The purpose of Ezra. If you remember, last week we ended our timeline with King Cyrus now being in power and letting the Jews return back to Jerusalem. Cyrus was kind of an interesting character for a king. I studied a little bit of the secular history about him, and it kind of made me think God uses different people down through time as he uses each one of us in our duties to teach others. But he used Cyrus, and it was interesting that Cyrus, history says, always put emphasis on winning the favor of the people that he conquered. When he conquered Persia, the Persians were fed up almost with their leader. And Cyrus took Babylon very easily, rode in with his army. There was no battle. We'll talk about that a little later. But he tried to win the favor of the people, and such as allowing the Jews to return to Palestine. He was a man full of compassion for a king at that time. And I just thought that was kind of interesting because that certainly helped out. Of course, we're told that God stirred up his heart, but it just seems that God used him and his attitude helped along with that, with the Jews going home. So we pick up today then. That was just a little sidetrack, tidbit of information. Is this on here?
Try it again.
Oh, try it again.
Button. Remember the right button.
No.
Oh, it's battery dead.
Battery's
Space-
dead.
space
Okay.
bar then.
So we use the arrow.
Yeah. Just a
There we
space
go.
bar.
Okay. So we're looking at the historical purpose this morning of Ezra, and our question was, what vital historical information? Dave threw us a trick question here. We're going to have to look into this one. What vital historical information does the book of Ezra provide that is not provided elsewhere in the Old Testament?
Give us a hint.
The which?
Can you give us a hint as to where we're to look?
Give you a hint. I had to give myself a hint without checking everything. Well, the only thing first that I thought was it provides the account of the remnant returning to their beloved homeland. In chapter 1 over to the first 2 chapters in Ezra. And that I thought for sure was about the only thing that I could find that is not recorded elsewhere. Of course, Ezra now, it also records the story of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. But now I'm not sure when we study Nehemiah if any of this is in Nehemiah.
And the minor prophets will have some of that too.
Right. Because later I'll show a little timeline we've got. There was a lot of other prophets writing at this time. And later in the Old Testament, sometimes we read them and we forget where we're at.
Another thing that I guess you could get from the book is that there were people living in the land, and we are introduced to the Samaritans in Ezra and Nehemiah that we're not introduced to anywhere else. I think you're on the more probably where Dave was going, but
yeah, that's a good point too, because we see that a little later on. That come to me. We see that in their struggles. Because remember, Jerusalem and Judea is inhabited, and it has been since they Israel was taken into captivity. But just the other prophets that we read of in the minor prophets, a lot of them speak of this time. So I wasn't really sure, but I thought the rebuilding of the temple was just something that happened at that time, and then the struggles that were experienced by the returning exiles and the rebuilding of the temple. I'm not so sure if that's recorded elsewhere. We'll soon find out when we get into the book of Nehemiah and some of the minor prophets. And I wondered too maybe about the recording of the support that was given the Jews from the Medo-Persian kings when they were getting ready. Of course, Cyrus was the first one. I'm not sure if that is recorded anywhere else in the Old Testament. So I thought, well, we can guarantee that the exile, the returning, the ending of captivity, I think was maybe what Dave was trying to get at. But with the others, we're good to remind ourselves of also. And so I had a map here of the Babylonian Empire at the time of Israel's captivity. Remember now, Cyrus, he also took over the Lydian kingdom up in the top there. Not at that time, but these were separate empires at this time when Cyrus began his rule. And then, of course, when he overtook Babylon, he also overtook Lydia at the time. So at this time now, Medo-Persian is the empire, is the ruling the world at that time. And we had Dave touched on some of the Medo-Persian kings that are named in Ezra. And if you remember last week, Jeremy had mentioned that some of the kings went by two names, and he was right. So we're not gonna stand that these are in the correct order, because I found Cyrus, of course, there wasn't much of a problem with. He was also known as Cyrus the Great. When he became king, Persia was a client state of the empire of the Medes, and Cyrus revolted and conquered the Median capital. He disposed of the king of the Medes, and then he went on to conquer Babylon and Libya. Jerry?
If you really want to get confused too, in the book of Daniel, we read of Cyrus as conquering Babylon. Right. And there's a man named Darius. And he's different than that Darius that's on the thing. There's Darius the Mede. And so, in the book of Daniel, when you read of Darius, some people get confused. Okay, are we reading of Darius that was contemporary with Cyrus, or are we reading of the actual Darius that was, like as far as when we read of Daniel in the lion's den, which Darius was that? And it doesn't say in that chapter, but there, at the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire, there's a co-regnancy. Cyrus and this other person, because this is two peoples. The Medes and the Persians are two peoples reigning as one king.
Right, exactly. Yeah, if you have time to study these, I just don't have the time when I'm trying to get through my lesson. I get off on tangents. You can be an hour just checking all of this. But I did with Cyrus. Well, we know he's in Ezra. Cambyses. He is spoke of. One writer believes in Ezra 4 and 6, but there he is called Ezra 4 and 6. Let me get my Bible open here.
Oh.
Right, that was who you See, in Ezra 4 and 6, we read now in the reign of Ahasuerus. How do you pronounce it? Ahasuerus. Okay, well now apparently that is who Cambius is supposed to be. So I don't know. It's like I said, I spent an hour checking these guys out.
That would seem to fit if you're looking at timelines.
That's
we're looking Ezra, like as far as it all depends on where you are, how much time you think is going to pass.
Right.
But they think Xerxes is Esther, so and so you'd back up. Darius is a fairly famous king, so he would probably keep the same name. You think some of the more minor kings tend to have more different names, whereas the big kings, the ones that show up in history,
right,
tend to not. But again,
I know
it's whether this is the same king or not, I don't know.
You're right, and to stand the ground and say, well, no, this is exactly who they are. For instance, the third king here, the Pseudo Smyrtus. Is that how you pronounce it? That's another thing, trying to pronounce all the names. But I read in a couple places where he was a cousin of the Cambyses, or however you pronounce his name. He only reigned a little while, and the other guy had him killed. And then another scholar said that he was the same as the second king there. So who knows?
Wow. It is interesting to know we are getting into the period of written history, of secular written history,
right?
And so we need to remember that there are gaps in history, in secular history, and so that's why there's even some why don't we know who this king is, or that, well, they haven't found evidence of it.
Right.
And secular history changes when they find new things, and so but we are starting to get, especially when you get down to 522, more written history of the secular kind.
Yes.
And it's amazing that when the Bible speaks of these people, it was right first, but they just couldn't prove it.
Right. We touch on that a little later on. Made an interesting point on that thought. But so anyway, these are some of the kings that ruled over the Persian Empire. Gordon, did you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, no? Oh, okay. But so this here, I threw in just to remind ourselves, Solomon reigned over a glorious nation at one time. And now Judah is returning to but just a portion of it. That's what they're returning to, down around Jerusalem. And it just kind of made me think, I looked at that other map, I thought, wow, that was Israel at one time, and now, because of her sin, speaking of sin being a reproach to a nation, now she comes back to only that at this time. And the rest of the land has been overtaken by Gentiles and idolatrous worshipers. So it's just kind of actually sad to see that, to remind ourselves of what Israel once was. And so next on our thoughts is the purpose of Ezra. We want to look at the doctrinal purpose of Ezra. And we're asked there, in what ways does Ezra demonstrate that God keeps his promises? Is there something that jumped out at you that speaks of the ways that God keeps his promises? you turn back to, or turn ahead in your Bibles to Jeremiah, that's quite a long reading.
Give us the highlights.
The which, Jerry?
Give us the highlights.
Just to sum up then, Jeremiah 25 verses 1 to 14. Jeremiah here for 23 years, we're told, warned Judah of the impending ruin and the deportation that was awaiting them unless they repented and turned back to God. He warned them for 23 years. Okay, and the prophet Daniel spoke of the fulfillment in this passage in Jeremiah. Jeremiah speaks of the ruin, but he also speaks of their return from captivity. But the prophet Daniel speaks of the fulfillment of this prophecy, as if you remember, he was an eyewitness to it, because remember, Daniel was one of the first that were carried away into captivity. If you recall that, I didn't write down, I think it might be in Daniel 1 where he speaks of that. But that deportation and that ruin that Jeremiah was warning Israel of came about, and Daniel was one of the first to be taken up.
What I gathered from the book of Ezra is that the ways of the remnants before Ezra returning to Jerusalem fell back into sin. And Ezra came and preached to them, and they repented because God was with Ezra. They started to prosper again.
Right. Well, Ezra, that was the second group that went back to Jerusalem, right? The first group went with Zerubbabel, right? And they rebuilt the temple. But yes, Ezra, that was what we'll touch on that later on. That was one of his main purposes, to get back there and to preach the book of the law, the book of Moses. You're right, Roy. We talk about that a little later on. We kind of look at Ezra and his character. But Jeremiah warned them, and Jeremiah also, though in that prophecy, speaks of Babylon being punished for 70 years for their iniquities. And then if you remember 2 Chronicles 36, 21 and 22, said something there in our Chronicles studies, back to 26, or 2 Chronicles 36, sorry. Verses 20 to 21. If someone has that, who's got? Jeremy, you got that?
Okay. And them that escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kings of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 80 years.
Okay, here before Ezra even, here Chronicles speaks of Persia, the 70 years, Nebuchadnezzar carrying them away. And then in Ezra 1, of course, verses 1 to 4, which we read last week, we see the fulfillment of Judah's release now, and the promise from Cyrus to allow them to return and build the house of the Lord. So Ezra in the book demonstrates, that God kept that promise to Israel.
It shows God's foreknowledge. He uses nations to accomplish his purpose. There was going to be a nation. Now, Jeremiah didn't mention the nation. He was going to raise up another nation to punish Babylon.
Right.
Babylon had existed at that time. Nebuchadnezzar existed at that time, and in Jeremiah's day. But God uses nations to punish other nations. He wasn't using Babylon because Babylon was so righteous.
Right.
He was using Babylon because Babylon accomplished his purpose to punish Judah. And he would punish Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom for their evil.
Yes.
He was not going to allow evil to, or like as far as people to say, well, God must have approved of the evil that they did. No, God used Nebuchadnezzar and would punish that kingdom later on.
Right. That's right. I read that verse. I didn't mark it down. I should have probably marked it down where what Jeremy just said, God spoke about that when their Babylon's time come, that they would be punished for their iniquities. But we see though that God's purpose at this time is to punish Israel, and so he uses Babylon to do that. And his purpose, no, his purpose, who are we to judge why God does these things?
So when you go back even to Pharaoh,
Yes.
when you come back and say, why did God raise up an other king at the time of Moses? And I had read a commentary, and it was actually quite an interesting reason. If they were living in luxury, would they have necessarily wanted to leave? And so God raised up a Pharaoh that treated them rather brutally, but he was going to show not only his power through this Pharaoh, but he was going to show his power to Israel. And they needed to want to leave. And but God works in the affairs of men. He does so even today. We don't always say, well, why is this person brought up, or why is that person brought up? Well, it's the same as always. We can't always see today God's purpose like we could back then. But to come along and say, well, God doesn't rule in the affairs of men today, he always has. So why can we say he is not today when the scriptures say that he does?
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't think it does us good when we maybe spend time on the why. You know, a chap asked me the other day, well, if your God's so gracious and merciful, why are there children dying and starving? You know, that's not the first time I've heard that one. I don't know how God operates. The only thing I know for sure that those children that die are certainly in better position than we are at this moment, and they are. You know, they're in paradise. There's no more problems. But why God does that?
There's a saying that used to be said, mine is not to question why. Mine is what to do. And that we can ask why all day.
Yes.
Job asked, why me? We don't know.
Right.
But mine is what to do.
Right. Yeah, your sermon a couple of weeks ago on Job kind of answers that thought. Who are we to challenge God and why he's doing things the way he's doing? You know, our purpose is just to obey him, so that when we die, we have the hope of eternity. And so then we move along here from the doctrinal course to the purpose of Ezra, and with each book we look at Jesus Christ. If you remember, each book in the Bible, we started back in Genesis. Christ is the overall theme in the Bible, and we have followed that through each book, okay, up until Ezra here now. And Ezra is no different. We can gather some important information also from the book of Ezra concerning Jesus Christ. And we're challenged with the question here is why is Zerubbabel considered a key figure? Why would you consider him a key figure in God's overall plan to redeem man through Jesus Christ? And if you remember, back in Genesis, as I said, Genesis 12 and verse 3, God makes a promise to Abraham back there. And it's, you know, sometimes we think we overuse this verse, but every time I read it, I'm reminded, God said, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. All the families. And so much down through time, different religious sects are killing the next guy for their cause. And God says right here to Abraham, and they all profess their belief in Abraham as their father, and yet to that man God says, I'll bless all people, not different nations. He'll bless them all the same, equally. And then to his descendant David, God said the same thing. Remember when we done the book 2 Samuel in chapter 7, 12, verses 12 and 13. God told David, through the royal line of David, a savior and a king would arise. And in Ezra, we're reminded that this promise is not forgotten. God hasn't forgotten this, because Zerubbabel is a descendant of David, which makes him an ancestor of Christ. And it's interesting, the point made is that Zerubbabel led the first captives, back to Jerusalem and began the rebuilding of the temple. We read that in Ezra 2, verse 2, Ezra 3 and 8. And then, of course, in Matthew 1 and in Luke, we have the lineage where Zerubbabel is in King David's line as being a descendant of David. And also, though, it's interesting that Ezra now and Zerubbabel and God and Cyrus place the people through whom Jesus Christ would come back in the land where he was going to come from. And then Ezra 2 and 1. Micah 5, look at Micah 5. Micah's back in the 12 group of minor prophets. But Micah 5 and 1, now muster yourselves in troops, or 2, sorry. But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrath, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Speaking of Christ. And so it's just interesting that, God sent Israel into Babylonian captivity, and now we see them leaving captivity, going back to their homeland, being led by Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel being a descendant of David, an ancestor of Christ, and he takes them back to the land that Jesus would be born in. Jim?
And it's interesting, Zerubbabel is not king, although he could have been king as far as as far as he was royal in lineage. But David's house was still leaders.
Yes.
Not as far as they were not at this time anyway, were not just the ones who laid back and did nothing. It was David's house that was still leaders among Judah, and God had not forgotten the house of David throughout all of captivity.
Right. I'm not sure, was he a governor or just, he was a leader for sure, because he led the people back. He wasn't just a run-of-the-mill.
As far as God, you don't know the answers for everything.
No, right.
Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong unto the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this book. So, as the secret things belong to God, what we need to know, he reveals it to us, and we don't need to know it.
Exactly. That verse underlined. We've used that. That's the perfect verse for that question. We gotta get it. I need to remember that. That's right. God's given us what we need to know, and what we don't know belongs to Him. And we have no right. You're right. We need to be content with what we do know, And that's why I say sometimes we challenge ourselves with the things we don't know. That just creates confusion. And it seems in human nature, confusion will create like a mistrust. Or, well, if that's the case, then can I believe this? And then before you know it, our faith is shipwrecked. And so moving on then, we come into the content of Ezra, and of course, the return of the remnant is the main content of Ezra. We have here a chart. Remember, the first return, Zerubbabel leads 50,000 home in 537 BC, and then the second return, Ezra now leads 2,000 back home in 450 BC. And I found this little chart was kind of interesting. Helps us. Sometimes, like I say, we read the minor prophets and we get confused with, well, I read this way back in Ezra. Well, remember, I found this little timeline, and we roughly from 538 to 558, that's the events in the book of Ezra. And Dave had that on his timeline. And we see Zerubbabel leading the first return of the exiles in the beginning of Ezra, chapters 1 to 6. And then in chapter 7 to 10, we read about Ezra now and the second return of exiles in 458. Well, in that time period, we look up on the top line, well, Esther, the events that we read of in the book of Esther are taking place in this timeline. But of course, there's no mention of that in Ezra. But then when we read Ezra or Esther, looking at timelines like this can help place in our minds what's going on. And then the events of the book of Nehemiah, they were after Ezra's second return, 445 to 425. I always have trouble with these numbers. I'm not a numbers guy, but we're counting backwards all the time on these numbers where we don't do that. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. Helps us place these events and time periods in our thinking. And so we're asked, what are some of the major differences? We just spoke about the two returns, Zerubbabel and then Ezra. And Zerubbabel is chapter 2, verses 1 to 70, and Ezra's return is chapter 7, 1 and 8. And Dave's asked this, what differences jumped out at you from the two returns that are recorded in this book? Is there something that one slide I just showed was
size?
The size, right, Jeremy? That's right. The numbers that of people that returned with Zerubbabel, 42,000 is the number I came up with. 360 Jewish captives, along with 7,000. We're told 337 servants went with them. And then with Ezra, how many went back? 2,000. Yeah. 2,000 compared to the 50,000 that, and that, brings up a lot of thoughts if we're thinking. It's interesting that Isaiah, you turn over to Isaiah 48, when we think of Isaiah 48 verse 20. Isaiah and Jeremiah both gave warnings to the yet-to-be exiled nation. And in Isaiah 48 and verse 20, Naomi, do you want to read that, please?
Go out from Babylon, flee ye from Chaldea, declare this with a shout of joy, proclaim it, send it out to the end of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob.
Okay, now, and Jeremiah 50, Isaiah is saying there to get out of Babylon. Okay? Flee, don't be wasting any time. And then in Jeremiah 50 and verse 8, Jeremiah 50 and verse 8. You got that, Jerry? 50
Yep.
And verse 8.
Yeah. From the heights of Babylon, go out of the land of the cherubims, and be like the lambs before the flocks.
Okay. Be like the male goats is the American Standard version at the head of the flock. The goats go. Get out. And then if you turn over to the next chapter, Veronica chapter 51 and verse 6. 51 and verse 6.
Flee from the midst of Babylon, and everyone save his life. Do not be cut off in their iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. He shall recompense her.
Okay, that's interesting, those three verses. Isaiah and Jeremiah are warning them to get out. And the opportunity came. Now Cyrus is letting them go, which brings up thoughts of why there was remaining, staying behind. Jeremy talked about secular history. Israel, the Babylonian captivity, they have much more freedom than in the Egyptian captivity. They would have been mingled in now with the people of Babylon, had businesses, making money. One thought, the first group, yes, they wanted to get out of there, get back to their beloved homeland. Maybe some of the remaining ones decided we don't want to leave. We're not told. It's just a thought, but we see for some reason that we're not really told about. Is that, Jeremy?
Finish your thought. Finish your thought.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to go the Jeremiah 29 and 10. After Isaiah and Jeremiah warned them to get out, we also read in Jeremiah, for thus says the Lord, when the 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you and bring you back to this place.
You notice the comparison between this and the Egyptian entry back into Canaan. They were coming in as conquerors the first time. They weren't coming in the same way.
Right.
God was not going, they were not going to have a large kingdom. They may have thought they were.
Right.
But they were never going to again be that kingdom. They were going to be ruled by, this was still under Medo-Persian rule. They were going to be ruled by Alexander the Great. They were going to be ruled by the nations that came after them, and eventually the Romans too. They were never going to be that nation again.
Exactly.
And God wanted them to trust in Him, not in their numbers. And so that's one of the lessons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even with them going back to Jerusalem at this time, the Medo-Persians still ruled the land. They just allowed them to go back there. That's a good point. Sometimes we overlook that. And Israel, we'll end with this thought, kind of going along with what Jeremy said there. Remember, Israel has long forgotten now God's blessings for His covenant people. If you read Deuteronomy 28, you will read in that chapter where God tells them that if they obey His commands, if they had it, then they would have been blessed. Their land would have never been taken from them. But we see that it wasn't God's fault. It's because they forsook Him. Okay, then we'll end there then. and we'll pick up next Sunday morning at that spot.